Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence that are getting hard to count. There's measles outbreaks, there's the Ukraine war, the invasion, there's climate change, there's the turbulence in the American political system and in the global economy with a new president who is feeling pretty empowered these days by having no congressional oversight, essentially. And the courts are in slow motion response. That's going to take time. And the impact on federal agencies in the United States is profound. And enterprises from education to science to weather forecasting and climate analysis are in deep states of disarray and demolition. And again, typically Congress is the one that determines budgets and the like, but for the moment, because of the Republican majorities who are really the party of Trump more than the party of republicanism, there's no sign of change so far. And I'm doing a show today that was scheduled to start at noon, but I wanted to start early because a special guest out in Oklahoma could come on for a little extra time. And that's Joe Friday, who was the director of the National Weather Service from 1988 through around 1997, through Republican and Democratic presidencies, and is one of the great deans of meteorology in this country. And he and I are now, I'm in the woods in Maine, and you're out in Oklahoma, and focused mostly on other things. But you've been pulled together with your compatriots, your four other past directors of the National Weather Service, and Joe together wrote an open letter in which, here's it posted on Joe's Facebook page, and I encourage you to follow him there. And where he wrote, as the oldest living former director of the National Weather Service, I'm glad to join all the rest of the former directors in this open letter. And Joe, rather than reading through the letter, of course, I'm hoping you can kind of summarize the key concerns that brought you together and what you hope can happen going forward. And then we're going to have several other guests come in around noontime and have a really valuable discussion of where we go in making sure people are safe and informed as these key seasons come together. So how did this begin, and what, just maybe a quick kind of a summary of the key takeaways.
Right, Andy. What really prompted this whole thing was the slow but steady degradation of the Weather Service that we saw at the beginning of this administration. When the first instructions came out for eliminating all conditional employees, we suddenly recognized the fact that we're going to be losing all of our input into the organization. And then when this budget document finally came out, we realized it was time to now say something. The budget document that is proposed for NOAA reduces NOAA by about 25%, and it attacks primarily the research arm of NOAA. Research is what makes us have the capability of doing a better job as we move forward. It was the research arm of NOAA that provided us with the Doppler weather radars that have been so effective in identifying severe storms and helping us with the storm forecasting. It's the research arm of NOAA that provides us with the capability of understanding how these storms develop and how they move, and exactly what is going on in the atmosphere. The research arm of NOAA has, unfortunately, the word satellite in it, or climate in it at some area. And as a result of that, it's being attacked because of the implications that this is what amounts to climate change. Nothing really could be further from the truth. The budget attacks the satellite programs and supposedly removes the satellite-related instruments. but there is no such thing as a separate satellite-related instrument. Every instrument on board those weather satellites has some merit in providing the meteorologist with better information and the computer models with better information for actually predicting the weather. It
Right.
also has an indication for what's going on with the climate, and that's also very important. The Climatic Data Center in Asheville, North Carolina, has seen a 50% or a 50-man reduction in their staff. And 50 people out of that amounts to about 30% of its staffing.
Incredible.
The Climate Data Center, the National Climatic Data Center in Asheville, is where the National Weather Service has historically stored all of their weather observations. These provide the climatic database for all the engineers in the country that have to worry about building bridges or building buildings that withstand certain weather conditions and so forth. So this climate data is not a climate change issue. It is basic engineering data needed for our economy across the board. It's almost like the removal of the Enola Gay photograph from the archives because it had the word gay in it.
Actually, I missed that one.
Oh, no, that was a big one here not too long ago.
Oh, my Lord.
On all the DEI, anti-DEI initiatives.
Right.
But the thing that worries me as much as anything, I mean, I'm worried about the research arm. It's vital for the continuation of the future. But I'm worried about the fact that we are now turning in the National Weather Service staffing into almost a Swiss cheese with random holes throughout the area. We've had several hundred people be eliminated either by being removed because they were provisional employees or conditional employees, or taking an early out and taking advantage of the programs that allowed them to leave early.
Right.
As a result of that, we have over 30 offices across the country that do not have a meteorologist in charge any longer. We have a very large number that are now faced with, can they operate 24 hours a day? And as you know, weather sometimes does strange things at night. And that makes it kind of important that we have staffing around the clock. This map that you're now showing is an example of part of this Swiss cheese type of activity that we have.
Right.
In addition to the meteorologists being reduced, we're also losing a fairly large number of electronic technicians. These are the people that maintain the radars, that maintain the weather equipment. And without them, it's very easy for a radar to go down in the middle of a severe storm type of activity and not be able to bring that back online in a reasonable time to continue to protect life and property. So it's not meteorologists, it's not researchers, it's not LTECs, it's all of them that work together to provide us what has been the best weather services in the world.
Right.
That, I'm sorry.
No, I don't want to interrupt. This is very valuable. So keep.
Well, that staffing reduction has now resulted in a large number of offices that are not able to launch their weather balloons twice a day as they had in the past. And the weather balloons are important for a lot of different reasons. They're important for understanding what the potential for severe weather is in the coming 12 to 24 hours as you look at the detailed structure of the temperature and humidity in the atmosphere as that balloon goes up. But it's also absolutely vital for the longer range numerical model forecast that feeds into our 8 to 10 day forecast, our 2-week forecast, and the like. And it's not only National Weather Service, it's not only the United States, that impacts the weather services around the world because that data is shared with all of the countries to input into all the computer models. So we're seeing an area that if I were a real cynic, I would think that there is a deliberate attempt to try to undermine the ability of the National Weather Service to do an effective job so that people will become disenchanted with it and no longer support it. The men and women of the Weather Service do a fantastic job of the work that they do. I've known situations where tornadic activity was moving over a particular residential area where some of our employees were working, but they stayed right on the job and went ahead and continued to produce the warnings and forecasts and distribute those to the emergency managers and make sure that everybody knew what was going on when they didn't even know if their house was still standing or not. Seen that happen in Oklahoma with the tremendous tornadic activity that we might have around here. I remember an incident back in the 80s in Erie, Pennsylvania, where that thing happened with the tornado moving right over the area where the person that was issuing the weather warnings lived. And his wife and kids were there, but he still issued the products and stayed by the radar to make sure that he got the data out. This is the kind of dedication you have with these men and women. And when they're faced with the uncertainties that the present administration is providing them, you now start to recognize the fact that, number one, they're overworked because they're now doing a lot more overtime, directed overtime than they had to do before. And a few hours of overtime is kind of nice to have a few extra bucks in your pocket. But if you're doing it every day, 7 days a week, it gets to where you just simply cannot function up to par any longer. The stress of the job, the stress of the uncertainties is going to have an impact. We're seeing that sort of thing happen in the air traffic control system now, for example.
Yeah.
The staffing of the air traffic control system is down. The uncertainties are such. We've had people leave, take some advantage of some of these outs, early outs and so forth. And we have situations such as at Newark right now, where Newark Airport just simply cannot function. And we're going to have offices that have that potential for happening in the National Weather Service. And that's the sort of thing that really kind of terrifies us former directors of weather services to realize how important the ability of the men and women to continue to perform their job, how dedicated they are. But that dedication can only go so far if they're not available to take care of the issues that are there.
Yes, and you've raised a number of key issues that we're going to get into with more depth now with Alan Gerard, a longtime National Weather Service professional meteorologist. He's here in the studio as well, and with Mike Smith, who has a long and lauded history in severe weather forecasting. He has his own blog, which I've referred to many times. And Alan recently retired after 35 years from service there, based in Oklahoma, where you are, and at other places. And we're going to discuss, where does this take us? I did a post a couple of days ago on this, and we'll be joined also by Andrew Freedman, who's now at CNN, who has a background in climate and meteorology and has become a really good broadcaster. So hello to both of you, Mike and Alan.
Hi, Andy. Nice to see you.
And you.
There's
Sorry.
one comment I would like to make, though, about what Joe just said.
Sure.
The extreme dedication is not limited to the federal service. During the May 1999 Hayesville tornado, our Paul Moloney continued to work that storm as his home was destroyed with his family in it. And Craig Denny and Scott Bright continued to work as their homes were damaged by that tornado. I don't in any way want to take away from the great dedication of the NWS employees. It's probably the best workforce in the entire federal government, but that dedication is not limited to the NWS.
Yeah, we've seen.
You're absolutely right, Mike. If I'd known you were listening, I would have been sure to say that.
Yeah, there's something about people who get into meteorology and get into severe weather meteorology, particularly, that leads to that level of devotion, I think, because so much is riding on your work.
Right.
I mean, obviously, journalists sometimes have that same feeling, when 9/11 happened. It was all hands, all day, all night, whatever, trying to understand what's happening. But the meteorology is special, and especially as we get into the spring here and the summer and the fall with our lengthening seasons for tornadoes, for wildfire in the West, and for hurricanes, even up where I live in Maine. We've had some very close calls. So I would love it if each of you, Joe Friday, I'm going to get back to you in a second, but Alan and Mike, if you could just describe the things that you see now that are sort of making your hair catch on fire, and they're different. You have distinct views of what needs to happen. So a little bit on your what's got you riled, and then what do we do about it? So we'll start with Alan. Alan, you have come to Substack recently, and you've been posting on the weather, your balanced weather Substack. But then here, right in the middle of it, so we have wet weekend from any unsettled weekend, and then there's this reflections on a day of change. Tell us about that day.
Yeah. So, as you said, Andy, my intent with my Substack was really primarily to focus on weather. I'm still, kind of as we were just talking about, most people that get into meteorology get into it because they have a love of weather and a love of service and all of that. And I still enjoy talking about weather, and that was really my primary goal. But I also feel like with everything that's going on, I kind of have a little bit of a unique background in that I was with the Weather Service for 25 years. The last 12 years, I was a meteorologist in charge in Jackson, Mississippi, which is obviously a very active office. And then for the last 10 years, I've been working with the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research at the National Severe Storms Lab. So there's not a ton of people, and there are a few, but not a ton of people that have that kind of background with both agencies. And given what's been happening the last several months, I thought I could potentially provide some insight for folks. I see a lot of things being talked about in the media, and a lot of it's accurate, but some of it, I think could benefit from a little bit of more detailed background in what happens in NOAA, and we've been talking a lot about the shortages in the various offices. And I think even though I've been gone for 10 years, the Weather Service structure is still very similar to what it was when I left. So I feel like I have some insights that I can give people on what the potential impacts of all of these changes are.
Yeah. So both Alan and Mike, I want you to hold your horses just for a second, because Andrew Freedman has come on, who's newly arrived at CNN as a senior correspondent for climate and extreme weather, and has a limited time window to join the conversation here. So if we can just hold what you're going to say about what do we do and your experiences and frustrations just for a second. Andrew Freedman, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. And we started with a really good conversation with Joe Friday, laying out the underpinnings of that complaint, that letter that's now circulating.
Yeah.
But we also just touched on your article that one of your first pieces at CNN. Let me just put it on screen here too. And I just want to kind of get your sense. You've been reporting now, whether it was through Capital Weather, Washington Post, Axios, and now here on different presidential actions. How far off the scale is what's happening now in terms of what you've experienced as a reporter?
I haven't seen anything quite like this. There's a lot of things that are going on in the Weather Service and at NOAA that compromise routine operations. So the meteorologist in charge stuff that we focused on was really trying to focus on like what does it mean to be missing the most experienced people in so many different offices, with one office in particular, Houston, Galveston, which is a hurricane-prone office that has no manager at all, which means in the language of the Weather Service, like the Science and Operations Officer, the Warning Coordination Meteorologist, and others are also absent. Those are missing positions, and there's a hiring freeze in place. But beyond that, beyond the staffing issues that we talked about in this story, there's also all sorts of shenanigans going on at the higher levels of NOAA, where the Secretary of Commerce has to approve any contract over $100,000, which means that they've gotten down to the wire several times now to approve the AWIPS contract, which is basically approving the contract for the software system that powers the Weather Service forecast offices. As well as the telecommunications gateway, which without that, you'd lose some private sector weather companies, as well as, Weather Service Forecast Office access. There's just a lot that's going on at the same time. So sometimes it can be a little bit hard to focus, but I haven't seen anything like this in the time that I've been covering NOAA and extreme weather and climate.
And that resonates with what Joe Friday was saying when we were first talking about, the cuts are often people who are sort of invisible, technicians maintaining Doppler radars. And it really is the death of 1,000 cuts in that way. It's across these dimensions. And you could never say that one lost position created worsened the scope of a hurricane disaster, but it's all there and it's systemic. Maybe back to Joe very briefly before we get to Alan and to Mike. Joe, again, your letter was a call to action. And how much of that's directed at Congress, and what else is there to do?
Well, it was clearly directed at Congress. They're the ones that can start to influence things, but it also takes pressure from the public in general,
right? So
that Congress recognizes the fact that they need to take action. I posted that letter on my Facebook page. It's already had almost 900 shares. There's a large number of the people there that have said that they have sent that letter to their representatives and to other people in the local area. So what we're really trying to do is to communicate what the situation really is along that line. The staffing in the Weather Service now is below 4,000. It hasn't been below 4,000 since I was director, all the time I was director of the Weather Service through now. This is the lowest it's ever been. And we have a nation that has weather from one coast to the other, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have a nation that depends on the data and the data information streams that NOAA and the National Weather Service provide. It also depends on the fact that we have a weather enterprise, which consists of the academic community, the private meteorological community, and the public National Weather Service community that is collectively the best in the world. That's the reason that we have the type of information that we have for protection of life and property, for applications to industry, all of those various activities. And as you pointed out earlier, the death from 1,000 cuts is really a factor here. More and more people that are missing from the organization stresses the organization from staffing wise, overtime, uncertainty in the future. I've saw employees on the Weather Service of the Weather Service on their Facebook page just beside themselves trying to figure out what their future holds. Vast number of these folks can make more money on the outside than they can on the inside. The electronic technicians, for example, they can usually double their salary going outside, and yet they have been dedicated to this organization. They understand how important their jobs are, and that means a great deal to job satisfaction. The same with the weather forecasters and the like. But the uncertainties these days about what the future really holds has a negative impact on the morale. It has a negative impact on their ability to really perform their job. They may be sitting there analyzing the data and all of a sudden think about, oh my gosh, how's that going to happen? How's that going to work out in the future? Am I going to be able to do that? Some of the provisional employees that have been reduced have been those that have recently accepted new jobs, have gone to new positions, have sold their old houses, bought their new houses, and now all of a sudden they're out.
Yeah.
These are the sorts of things that really have a major negative impact on people.
So I'd like, Andrew, I know you have a limited window. So if you have any questions for Joe or any of the other folks here on the screen, and then Mike, I have some questions for you for sure related to one of the things that hasn't come up yet is, the average person may not understand that the weather forecast they see on their screen or hear on the radio doesn't come magically from just the private sector. You have to have this underlayment of data and expertise. So Andrew, any point observations or questions?
Well, I guess I'm interested in what led to that letter that all the former Weather Service directors sent, and how high the level of concern is there. I imagine it's very high for that to happen. And I would point out two things on the congressional piece, which is that the continuing resolution that Congress passed does leave leeway, unfortunately, for the Weather Service and for NOAA and OAR, the Office of Atmospheric Research, or Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, to be restructured in the meantime without congressional input, because the way the CR was written. So there may be more big changes coming, as I think Alan has written about, even without congressional action. The Weather Service is in kind of a different box, but OAR is a pretty prime target. And as you know, Joe and everybody else here, if you don't have the research to applications, you're not improving the way the Weather Service is forecasting the weather. You're not doing warn on forecast rather than warn on detection, that sort of thing.
So two questions. What led to the letter, Joe, and then this issue about the structure of the budgeting?
Okay. Well, what led to the letter is just watching over the last few weeks of the increasing degradation of the staffing of the Weather Service, whether it was the elimination of provisional employees, whether it was the early outs that were taking place and all of that. But then when the budget document came out and the with the cuts that were there, then this was the thing that we said, okay, we've talked about doing it. We said, okay, it's now time to get it done. And so we did. The issue with respect to OAR, that's a devastating thing. OAR provides the intellectual lifeblood of all of the organizations, whether it's Weather Service, Ocean Service, or else otherwise. And has been absolutely vital. Every summer, we have the researchers from the National Severe Storms Lab. It's changed its name now, but I'm still old school. From the National Severe Storms Lab, sitting next to operational forecasters from the Severe Storms Forecast Center, working out better ways of handling the severe weather forecasting and making improvements in that. There'll be major joint studies going on, deployments of equipment to try to work on the details of that. That has been absolutely critical for the ongoing improvements. Historically speaking, the National Severe Storms Lab is where most of the work on the Doppler weather radars took place. That gave us the capability we have these days across the country for the type of capability we have for storm detection and prediction. It's difficult to think of an organization, NOAA's an organization, without that research arm. One of the things that was suggested is moving those specialized research activities in the organization. That's not necessarily a good idea from an organizational standpoint. It's always difficult to put into an operational organization the research arm, because if you're really pressed for monies to improve the operation, you may be tempted to try to take that out of the research arm. And you don't want to eat your seed corn, as an old farmer would say.
Right. Mike, I'd like to hear from you on these things.
I have, first of all, to introduce myself.
Yeah.
I've been in the private sector for more than 50 years. I was the founder of Weather Data Incorporated, which was a company that specialized in extreme weather forecasts and warnings for commercial clients. 2006, I sold it to AccuWeather, where I became the head of AccuWeather Enterprise Solutions, its business arm, where we did extreme weather forecasts. And I retired in 2018. And because many people have asked this question, I am no longer working for AccuWeather. I'm on my own. Now, with that little bit of introduction, I think there is tremendous public support for the National Weather Service and its core mission, and that is making forecasts and warnings for the public at large that save lives and mitigate property loss. However, the Weather Service has gotten quite a bit away from that over the last decade with something called integrated decision support services. I don't think there's much, if any, public support for sending 4 meteorologists from the Fort Worth Forecast Office to Texas Speedway to support a NASCAR race during a tornado watch, which really happened. And there are other egregious cases of the Weather Service getting far away from its core mission. And I think that the Weather Service needs to take a look at how it's conducting its strategic business plans these days. I also think while President Trump deserves a fair amount of blame, I don't think anyone has brought up the fact that Congress did not allow the first nominee of President Trump to take the job at NOAA, Barry Myers, and it has not ratified President Trump's nomination, the excellent Dr. Neil Jacobs, as head of NOAA during this term. And so it's pretty hard for President Trump and the Department of Commerce to run NOAA and to run the NWS with one arm tied behind its back. President Trump, when he makes an excellent nominee, as is Neil Jacobs, deserves to have that nominee confirmed. And that hasn't happened. And it didn't happen with Barry Myers either.
Has anyone heard why the Republicans who control that process have
Well, as I understand it, that you have to have 60 votes for it to move forward. A simple majority is needed to confirm Dr. Jacobs, But I'm told that through procedural goings on, I don't know the correct internal language here, there has to be 60 votes to move the nomination forward. Now, I'm not a politics guy, so
Sure.
I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what I'm told.
Alan, do you know anything more about that, or actually, Andrew? It does sound like a part of the story.
Yeah, I talked to the Senate Commerce Committee last week, trying to find out where this stood, because you both have Neil Jacobs as a nominee, and you have one other high-ranking political position that's open that has been nominated for, which is sort of Neil's right-hand man, and I was told the paperwork from the nominees are not in, so they cannot hold a hearing. There's not necessarily objections to him on either side of the aisle. It's a slowdown in the procedure.
Right.
But the joke that was made back to me was, by the time Jacobs gets there may not be much of Noah left. That's essentially what they said.
That's not a very haha joke, especially with hurricane season poised to begin.
No.
So
what a system.
Just to finish my thoughts, I do not have as high opinion of NOAA as some of the other people on this panel. I think they have starved the National Weather Service of resources. I do not believe it has done a good job managing the National Weather Service. And it's my opinion, the NWS, along with parts of NOAA like NESDIS, should be spun off into a standalone agency like NASA, and let the Weather Service, which is very important to our nation, stand alone, get its funding as directly from Commerce rather than having to come through NOAA.
What does that sound like to you, Joe? This reminds me a little bit of aspects of aviation safety and the like, splitting off the delineating the safety part from the other parts. But anyway, any thoughts on that? Structural question?
Well, Mike has opened up a can of worms, and as a good friend of mine, Vern Sumi, once said, the only way to recover things when you open a can of worms is to get a bigger can.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
There are issues between Weather Service and NOAA. There always have been. NOAA was put together as an environmental agency under the Nixon administration. It brought together everything, literally that they could. And if you take a look at history, NESDIS used to be a part of Weather Service. Satellite Applications Branch was a part of National Weather Service when the meteorological satellites were first developed in the 1960s. The National Climatic Data Center used to be a part of National Weather Service. What is now the Severe Storms Forecast Center, or not Forecast Center, the laboratory used to be a part of National Weather Service. So all of this spun off as they brought in other environmental activities and tried to put together an organization that would support everybody. I was not particularly happy when some of the centralization of NOAA activities occurred, because it ended up with costing me more money than it was doing when I was doing it all by myself, with procurement and personnel actions and all of that. And then they were centralized under the administrative support centers. But that being said, NOAA works reasonably well now overall. There are issues with it. The leadership issue is one that is a major issue, not having an administrator of NOAA, and that needs to be resolved reasonably well. I was asked by one of the reporters, I can't remember which one, a few months ago when this whole thing was starting, did I expect a rapid selection of a NOAA administrator? And my answer was that, well, historically, we don't have a rapid selection of a NOAA administrator. And that's usually because most of the NOAA operations work pretty well on their own. And they do. I would not like to see OAR destroyed. I would like to see it strengthened, focused, better supported where it needs to be supported, prioritized. And maybe this is the opportunity to do so, but it's a little difficult to tell with the directions that have been given by OMB.
Boy.
Andy, if I could just add on to what
please.
Joe and Mike have been saying, I will just say, and I've tried to make this point in some of my Substack articles about this, that as someone that's been, in various management and leadership positions in both OAR and the Weather Service for the last 20-something years, I definitely share that there is definitely need for adjustments to focus both within the Weather Service and OAR, and there are definitely ways in which the structural makeup of the organizations could be adjusted that I think would be much more efficient and much more targeted toward the core mission of the Weather Service and NOAA. But my concern right now is we're creating an environment where that's very difficult to have that conversation, because in a constructive way, because we're essentially, as Joe alluded to, this kind of Swiss cheese approach where we're not targeting any change or cuts. We're just doing it in a very haphazard, across the board, not even across the board approach. Just, you have the Houston office, which is now without any, management staff, and which as someone whose daughter lives in the Houston area is something I'm quite concerned about. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
And that's where I really feel compelled to talk about this, because I do feel like we need to be having these conversations about some of the things that Mike and Joe have brought up about how to best organize the Weather Service. And sorry, I got a little off tangent, but one thing I wanted to make sure I followed up on was Joe's comment about it may not be a good idea to have your research arm within the operational structure. And I, as someone that's been on both sides, I completely 100% agree with that. If for no other reason, then it's hard for an operational entity, particularly one that's under stress for all the various reasons that the Weather Service is right now, to keep any kind of a focus on the future. And while I think OAR and the Weather Service, and particularly the Severe Storms Lab and the OAR labs that are focused more on the Weather Service, like Global Systems Lab and AOML, HRD, Hurricane Research Division, I think we've developed a really good interaction between the two agencies, like Joe was talking about the hazardous weather test bed, that really lead to solid research to operations development. And I really do worry that if that just becomes the Weather Service operating those kind of research, not only, as Joe said, do you have the potential for those to get cut very quickly when there's stress on the budget and resources, I also just think that some of the more innovative type approaches could get derailed early on because the Weather Service has a difficult time visualizing how they could be utilized.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, cut in here.
Sure. Oh, I'm done.
Many people have said, how wonderful it is that OAR has done this work with the Severe Storms Lab, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is tornado warnings are less accurate than they were 15 years ago, a fact that even the Weather Service finally acknowledges. Tornado watches are at best flat compared to where they were 10 years ago. So I keep hearing the phrase improvements. I'm not seeing where these improvements are as far as the products for the general public are concerned. Now, again, I know as well as anyone that you have good years, you have bad years, that unforeseen circumstances arise. But at the same time, I'm not as enamored, maybe that's not the right word, I apologize if it isn't, with the job OAR is doing with regard to improving severe storm forecasts. I think there's very little evidence that they've improved the last decade.
Yeah, and I've had Mike on my webcast to talk about this, and it relates, I would wonder where that feels like an area where then you'd want more crosstalk with the research folks to say, unless it's very clear that the failure is a staffing failure or a distributed, something's not happening in Norman or in Mississippi that should have happened to translate the modeling into a warning. Alan, quick question for you.
Well, just to follow up on what Mike was saying, I'll just say flat out, I share Mike's concern about the fact that the watches and warnings are pretty flat for the last 10 years. But having said that, I think that what we're talking about here, as far as putting the research back in to the Weather Service, would only make that problem worse, because I think the problem is really more about the resources that the Weather Service has for getting the research that OAR is doing into operations than it is about the quality of the research that's being done.
Andy, since we had that conversation, I have heard from 5 NWS field personnel from all over the country east of the Rockies. And to a man and to a woman, and they've all asked for anonymity, which I've granted, to a man and to a woman, they say they are, and this is before any of the staff.
Yeah.
That to a man and to a woman, they say they do not have time because they're too busy with IDSS, that IDSS has taken their focus away from severe storm and extreme weather forecasting. And it would be one thing if I heard it from one person, if I heard it from 2 people. I've heard it now from 5, from forecast offices all over the country. And most of them, although not all, talk about the very poor level of training that new hires into the Weather Service get regarding radar interpretation and tornado warnings. This is what I said earlier. I think there is huge support for the Weather Service's core mission. I think there's very little support for IDSS.
Well, I'd love to hear from both Joe and Alan on that. It feels like certainly these brash cuts that are being made are the antithesis of what you're talking about.
Oh, no question.
Yeah. Joe, thoughts on that?
Well, quite frankly, having been out of the Weather Service operations now for 30 years, I cannot really speak to what the internal activities are with respect to IDSS and so on. I understand what it is, but I don't know. I do know that there were several things going on in the National Weather Service while I was still keeping fairly close tabs of it that I thought could have been done better. Mm-hmm. And that is, as I mentioned to Andy before, when we started this conversation, it's kind of unusual for all 5 of the directors to agree on the same thing, with the letter, because we didn't agree on some of the other areas. I mean, there was, in my opinion, there was too much work being put in to maintaining the quote grids unquote. as opposed to other activities in the area. Now, beyond that, I don't know. I will tell you this, though, just for records. When I first came in the National Weather Service, the average lead time for a tornado warning was -2 minutes. When I left the Weather Service, the average lead time for a tornado warning was around 12 minutes.
And it's, Joe, it's fallen back now to 8 minutes.
Well, that's really a shame. And the percentage of tornadoes that we warned for when I first came in the Weather Service was 20%.
Yes.
It went up to about 80% when I was leaving the Weather Service.
And it's now back down to 58.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I'll agree with Joe that, obviously I've been out of the day-to-day of Weather Service operations for 10 years. So I don't want to act like, I think I still have a pretty good pulse on it from, talking with colleagues and my interactions, as part of the Severe Storms Lab. But I'll just say that right before I retired, I actually gave a talk at a Weather Service training, severe weather training event, where I actually went back and looked at a lot of the statistics that Joe was just talking about and that Mike correctly pointed out where they've gone since. And while my guess is that Mike and I would probably have a difference in opinion on where decision support services should fit into the Weather Service at some level, what concerns me is that I do think it's an important conversation that we should be having. And I do think that there is a definite issue with not enough emphasis being placed in the Weather Service on the core severe thunderstorm and tornado warning mission. And that kind of goes to what, my point is about that. If you put the research back in, I think a lot of the pressure that comes right now on the Weather Service to improve things as far as severe weather is coming from folks like us talking about it and the external pressure to improve it again. And I think we're all in agreement here that the haphazard cuts are not are not effective to giving us the opportunity to have the conversation, because I do think that there needs to be a serious conversation about, how we go from where we are today to in my opinion, we need to not only improve the tornado warnings that the way they're issued right now, which I do think we need to be focusing on getting the lead time and the probability of detection back up again where it was and improving it. But we also need to be focusing on how do we get some of these, and it's probably in partnership with the private sector, just to be clear, how do we start getting these entities that need more like 60 to 90 minutes of lead time, some of the groups that I know Mike has focused on, how do we start working together as an enterprise to get that information out there?
Well, I think that's much less of a problem than many within the Weather Service believe it is, because there are at least 6 private sector companies that issue independent tornado warnings, including the extended type of lead time you're talking about, Alan. And to me, if Texas Speedway needs a 90-minute tornado warning, they got the budget for it. They should be hiring a private sector weather company. Fort Worth should not be sending 4 meteorologists to the track during a tornado watch. That said,
that's interesting.
The issues I'm bringing up existed 6 months ago before any of these cuts. And so, cuts or not, there are some fundamental problems with the way the Weather Service is executing its core mission, and those concern me a great deal.
So this we could do another focused discussion of tornadoes, and I want to get into.
Well, it's not just tornadoes.
I know.
They blew a blizzard warning forecast for the Kansas City area this past winter. It's not just tornadoes, unfortunately.
One thing I wanted to get at briefly, and Joe, I don't know if you've been in or tracking this. This is something I know Mike is passionate about because we've talked about it so many times. Are we learning enough from our mistakes? So we're sort of getting away from the whole question of the immediate Trump budget crisis, but looking at the systemic challenges here, which clearly still exist for certainly for tornado warnings, a little bit for flash flood as well, and hurricanes. We're getting, I think, things are. I wouldn't say getting better, but there's this systemic failure to look at lessons from events that have occurred, and this is the idea that Bill Hook and others a long time ago were starting to call for something like the National Transportation Safety Board, but for disasters, for weather-related disasters, and it's become a passion of mine and of Mike's too to drive that conversation. Whether you call it a disaster safety board, a NDRB, you name the statistic, but like it doesn't seem that anyone out there is adequately tracking things like what's up with tornado warnings. If we're not making progress or we're actually regressing, is it the National Academy of Sciences that should be doing a study of that, or should we have a federal an analytical agency that advises Congress and the community on that? Or what should that look like?
Well, Alan knows better about what has been going on lately than I do, but we used to do an analysis on every major weather event that caused a large number of a large loss of life and property, and we tried to identify where we could have done better and all of that, and that was a routine thing that was done. I don't know if that's being done anymore or not.
And it's not being done because, as one high-level headquarters NWS official told me, and he told me in writing, I was very surprised about this. The Weather Service no longer wants to do service assessments when the Weather Service does poorly on an event. And most of the time these days, the Weather Service is doing poorly on major events. And again, I have that in writing from a high-level NWS official.
Alan, what do you think?
Well, my understanding is, and I didn't know what Mike just said, obviously, but my understanding is that at least for now, the Weather Service is not generally doing service assessments in the way that they used to, and that Joe is describing. I was part of several service assessment teams, both in my time at the Weather Service and since I've been with the Severe Storms Lab. But I do think, and again, I think this kind of goes back to this idea about, whether it's the research aspect or whether it's this aspect, which I think having seen that idea from Bill and Andy and Mike and others, in the last, number of years, of the idea of having some sort of an external entity that's doing this kind of evaluation of disaster events and keeping these kind of statistics, I think is really important. And I don't think it's a good idea, just as I don't think it's a good idea for the operational entity like the Weather Service to be responsible solely for the research. I don't think it's a good idea for them to be responsible for this as well. I think you need some independence, and I think you need some focus on the specific problem. One of the things, and I know, not to get it back into tornadoes and severe weather and all that, but I know one of the things that's been an ongoing problem with the severe storms community has been having accurate severe weather reporting. And the reality is, when the operational entity is responsible for it, their focus is going to be on verifying their warnings, not on just the independent gathering of the most accurate, of the best information possible. Now, I do think that each of the 122 offices brings kind of their own focus to it. I know when I was a meteorologist in charge, I really tried to push the importance of gathering that information for a science and climatological perspective and to be able to do the kind of disaster reviews that we're talking about. But it varies by office, and I think that that's why having some sort of independence would be really important.
In my proposal for a National Disaster Review Board, one of its explicit tasks is gathering the statistics as to severe weather occurrences, not just tornadoes and severe thunderstorms, but blizzards, ice storms, and all of it, so that those statistics are kept independently. There are times when the Weather Service has done a magnificent job anticipating a major event, such as the Maui wildfire. It did an incredible job, went above and beyond the call of duty in letting local officials know that 4 days into the future, there was going to be an unprecedented high risk of wildfires. So what did the local emergency managers do on the island of Maui? All 8 of them got on an airplane and went to Honolulu for a meeting. And no emergency managers were left on Maui when the fire started and grew. This is the sort of thing, though, that a National Disaster Review Board would be able to uncover quickly, instead of me trying to dig all this stuff out on an individual basis. It's very difficult. And so
for me as a journalist,
yeah,
yeah,
I want to know when the Weather Service does well, so that those best practices can be promulgated throughout the NWS and throughout the meteorological community. When there's a problem, I want to know about it so it can be fixed.
Yeah, and this also gets at this is all interdisciplinary and interagency as well. We haven't talked about FEMA, and FEMA is also being essentially dismantled as we speak. Even a Republican state like Arkansas was fighting with the White House over relief, but that doesn't get at the preventative work, and they've been shredding the budgets at FEMA that are designed to boost preparedness. So it's systemic, and that's why having a review board that isn't just a NOAA entity or a commerce entity, but that can look at those interlaced dynamics that turn a hazard into a disaster is critical.
Yeah, just real quick, Andy, I'll just add to that one of the things, my master's degree is actually in emergency management, and so I that's part of the reason I wanted to come to the Severe Storms Lab, was to do more of this interdisciplinary work. And I think that what you just touched on there is really crucial. The private sector, the emergency management community, the broadcast meteorologists all play a huge role in both the prevention and the warning and response to these disasters. And the reality is, at least right now, the way the Weather Service is structured, that getting to the what went right and what went wrong and all of these aspects of an event is not their focus. It's not what they're resourced for, and it's not what they have the expertise in. You really need an interdisciplinary group to be able to do this work effectively. Right.
And unfortunately, in all my reporting for decades on a whole host of hazards, human, anthropogenic, and natural, this is still a consistent failure most of the time. Yeah. I did some work for the UN DRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I was involved with vetting one of their reports when I was at Columbia. And it's all there on paper, like I'm showing you right now. Here's a great FEMA document, community disaster resilience zones, building resilience through private sector partnerships. But having it carry out is really hard. And if you're not assessing in an iterative way, meaning learning and adjusting, it feels like we're always going to be having these conversations. I want to swing back as we come toward the close here. It's about 10 minutes to go toward the letter and toward the need for some urgent action from Congress and or the public and the public, including the private sector businesses that are at risk because of the way things are being played out. The letter. If I would love to know what a letter like this might look like in 10 years, a celebratory letter of former agency heads on, wow, we got it right, and this is what we did.
Well, I probably won't be a participant in that letter.
Well, 10 years, you're pretty healthy, knock on wood. You're 86, I think, right? Yeah, I think Joe told me he's 86 right now. So yeah.
Well, you're a young 86, Joe, and you have contributed magnificently to weather science in this nation. And if you want to get out of the day to day, I wouldn't blame you a bit.
So, with all of this in mind, the one thing I wanted to get at, which is something Joe knows a lot about, is there was another time when there was a DOGE. It had a different name. It was under Clinton Gore. And it came up actually on Bill Maher's show the other day when he had Al Gore on. So let me play it's like a minute clip here. And Joe, if you could reflect on the way government reform and job reduction happened then and what's been happening now. So hold on a second. Hopefully this will work.
Use it every day. You're more relevant than ever. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Department of Government Efficiency, because I certainly remember when you didn't use that title, but you could have. You did something very similar. Could you just compare and contrast for the class?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We had a project called Reinventing Government, which was REGO, they called it, and it was actually quite successful by pretty broad consent, the bipartisan analysis, and we had the benefit of doing it over 7 years, but we eliminated 426,000 positions. Mostly with buyouts. We went to the Congress to get legislation. We saved $126 billion, $136 billion, 640,000 pages of rules and regulations eliminated. Not a single lawsuit ever filed. And we did it by working with the federal employees. The director, Elaine Kmark, was the person who helped me do this. And I want to give some credit to her and the team, Bob Stone, Bob Kaminsky. We had a great team, but I went to every single department and agency and started with the janitorial staff and worked all the way up to get the culture and to understand what was going on.
Boy, that sounds interesting, and it's fascinating to think that happened, but it happened evidently in a systemic way. There weren't lawsuits, and things got done. Now we'd have to have a big assessment with some experts on how effective it was. How do you measure how big government got versus because of something or not? Attribution science, right? Like with climate. But that basic idea of working from the bottom up and getting to understand the system seems the antithesis of the concerns you laid out in your letter, Joe.
Well, as discussed by several members of this particular panel today, there are areas for improvement in virtually every organization. But taking a hatchet to it, or a chainsaw, as the case may be, doesn't usually result in a very effective solution to that. We went through a very detailed analysis of the National Weather Service for our modernization and reorganization that we did when we were trying to place our offices across the country in a way that could provide reasonable services to everybody, not just those in the big cities, but out in the rural communities and the like. We went through a very detailed analysis that looked at the staffing levels, looked at what we needed to do. We had discussions back and forth, and it was an organized fashion that resulted in the modernization of the National Weather Service. We came down a little bit in staffing, but not a lot. We reorganized our staffing so that it better fit the jobs that we needed to do. And that was a very successful approach. I remember the Reinventing Government operations. There was a heavy discussion associated with that on contracting out various activities, what could be contracted out, what should not be contracted out. And we went through a lot of those activities in a very deliberative fashion. I didn't like going through some of them because they were pains, but nonetheless, by the time we finished those, we actually ended up with a better overall organization, I believe.
Yes, that's Joe. No question, that's true.
Well, let's see if the tide can shift. I get, maybe I'll ask you each one more brief question, which is about what's your worst nightmare about related to what's going on. Let's start with that. What aspects of this are so just drive you crazy, and maybe Mike, not just about right this moment, but how this is building on top of existing issues.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. My nightmare, because I'm in the central United States, is another Udall type tornado, an EF5 occurring in the middle of the night. It's not properly warned of. The sirens don't go off, and hundreds of people are killed. We had a taste of that in Kansas City on June 8, 2022. We had a nighttime tornado at 1:30 in the morning. The radar was being operated on 7-minute, believe it or not, intervals, even though there was lofted debris associated with the tornado. It went right down my daughter's street without any warning whatsoever. And again, that was before the cuts. Now that we have the cuts, I think that becomes a bigger risk. And so I worry tremendously about nighttime tornado killing many, many people.
That's again, the warning issue is a critical one. Alan.
Well, given where I am, I probably have a very similar worry to what Mike is saying, but just to build on that, and this is maybe something a little more, subtle, but you alluded, I think it was you, Andy, that talked, or maybe it was Joe that talked about the electronics technicians and the shortages there. I'm really growing increasly concerned about that and the stability of the weather radar network.
Yes.
Again, I know that everybody involved is going to do their best to keep it running, but the reality is, from what I'm hearing, the electronics technician staffing is getting pretty short in a number of offices, and we're dealing with increasing issues with having the right equipment to replace, to do parts replacement, and having the resources to be able to get people out to do the work. And the reality is, I think that we as a nation kind of take for granted that anytime we can just call up a website or something and see what's going on the radar. And not only is that a problem for the Weather Service if they don't have access to that radar data to do the kind of warnings that Mike's talking about, it's a problem for the private sector, not only private sector meteorologists, but just the private sector in general that relies on that information.
Right. So, Joe, over to you.
I agree that both of these discussions before by Mike and Alan are certainly nightmares. The real concern that I have is that this period that we have just gone through is going to result in a situation where it's going to be difficult to get good talent to come into the government again. The uncertainties that have been there, the flip-flop back and forth between hiring, firing, rehiring, and then firing again. What kind of future is that? The way our workforce has been treated by this chainsaw activity is causing a lot of people to say, hey, I don't need to put up with this nonsense. there are a lot of other opportunities.
Right. By the way, you know, as you were saying that, I was realizing you were reflecting a dynamic that's also underway internationally. Countries are losing trust in the United States as a trading partner.
Yes.
Because of uncertainty. It's the same.
And a defense partner.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. Yes, even more so. So there you have it. We are, I feel like this is just, again, most of my Sustain What conversations are the beginning of a conversation. Mike, you know, I want to keep pressing disaster review board with you because for me, the interdepartmental, intersectional issues are enormous. We didn't even talk about building codes. And, you know, I want Amazon. I wrote several pieces about when Amazon's warehouse blew up in a tornado.
Right.
And did they actually put in tornado shelters now or not? You know, I interviewed a guy at a company who had experienced a tornado personally many years earlier, and he and his warehouses put in tornado shelters, not an Amazon giant, you know, massive profit-making thing. And then they had another tornado and everyone was okay. So these issues go even beyond forecasting and warning. They go to investment, to code, to public understanding of science, which of course is being also degraded. You know, remember the disinformation storm around Hurricane Helene. You know, there are thousands of bodies in the streets, and, and a young videographer went to that town and found it was basically a disaster. Some people died, but it was manageable. So the disinformation.
Well, I understand the official death toll is now up at just north of 230. So it was a big loss of life.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah. Yes. And it could actually have been worse. You know. So there's lots of work to do here. And Alan Gerard, thank you for your Substack. Thank you for your service, all of you, and private sector, and especially Joe as the longest term participant in this thing called risk reduction, which is really the core of what we're talking about here. Thank you for your service too. But we'll have to do more. I just think it's really key to keep up this conversation and draw in more people. I had a congressman on, Sean Casten from Illinois, a couple of weeks ago. If we could get a couple of Republicans on if they will come out of their foxhole. Yeah. But they're all in duck and cover mode, you know. Yes. And it's. But and then what's going to happen? You know, maybe I'll close with I would hate this to happen. Okay, I would hate for this to happen. But Trump, and I wrote this the other day. I would dread that Trump has a moment like George Bush had after Katrina.
Right.
With let me see if I got this set up right. Right here. Ronnie, you're doing a heck of a job.
Yeah.
You know, I as I said, the last thing we need is a true epic disaster. But Trump is setting us up for some real big problems with FEMA chaos, with NWS chaos, with the dispiriting impact on federal employees, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks for coming on. This is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What. There's actually a substantial audience watching right now. So if there's any more takeaways anyone wants to offer, we can go a little longer. Alan, you know, what do you hope? And people should obviously check out your Substack. It's called balancedweather.substack.com.
Yes.
But any last thought for those who are watching?
I would just say, you know, I think hopefully, you know, this panel here showed that there's a lot of, let me rephrase this. Mike or Joe one was saying earlier that there's a lot of public support for the Weather Service, and I completely agree with that. And for you know, the research aspect too. I think when you go around Oklahoma, and you know, which is obviously a red Republican state, there's tremendous support for severe weather research, for severe weather operations, and just talking briefly about my Substack, like I said, I got into it primarily for the weather aspect of it, but I can tell you that when I make a post related to the topics we're talking about today, they get a lot more interest and sharing. I can see the statistics. I know there's a lot of people out there that really care about this, and I just think it's important for us to keep having these kind of conversations. And if you're somebody watching right now and this is important to you, let your friends and family know about it. Let your representatives know about it. Let your, elected officials know about how important it is to you.
That sounds like a good takeaway for sure. Share the issues, share the opportunities. Mike, one last thought for you.
I write about this. Thank you for putting my blog up. I write about these topics quite frequently at MikeSmithEnterprisesblog.com. But to me, the bigger takeaway is the National Weather Service is a public good that should be supported by everyone. I can't think of any good reason not to support the core mission of the National Weather Service. That means, though, that it needs up-to-date tools like a next generation of radars yesterday. It needs well-motivated and well-trained people. I think the motivation is there. Lately, perhaps some of the training is not what it should be, but we need a state-of-the-art National Weather Service. I think there is tremendous public support for that, but I think the Weather Service also, going forward, desperately needs to focus on its core mission and stop some of these things that are expensive in terms of manpower and resources that are not related to its core mission.
That sounds reasonable. Again, and one thing I agree on with you as well is actually it's popped right out of my brain, my AARP brain.
It happens to me all the time, Andy.
But believe me, the Disaster Review Board, again, we can do much more of that. And Joe Friday, longtime director of the National Weather Service, last thought.
Mike hit on a point that I probably should have mentioned earlier. The radars that we depend on today were designed in 1988.
Right. That's the point I was making.
They have been very good.
Yes.
They are wearing out. We need to replace them. There is new technology that will not cause us to have to spend 7 minutes to determine what's going on. It can provide virtually instantaneous views of what's going on every 30 seconds. And that provides much better capability than we have. We need to replace those. Again, I want to stress the fact that the men and the women in the Weather Service are indeed dedicated. And I agree with Mike. It's not just the public sector, it's also the private sector. It takes a strange person to go in the weather business because people are going to be criticizing you all the time. Yeah. You hear all the jokes, you hear all of the comments. Anybody that can be wrong 50% of the time and still get a paycheck.
Yep.
Well, we need to not be wrong 50% of the time. We need to be better all the time. We need to improve our technology.
Yeah.
We need to improve our training. The review board is a wonderful idea whose time I think has come. And I really appreciate Andy to be able to participate in this. And even though I am the oldest surviving director of the National Weather Service, former director of the National Weather Service.
Well, because you are, I think you need to be in these conversations. And you should also get some young meteorologists in the conversation, Matt Capucci and others in the private sector and elsewhere. How do you sustain? Actually, I don't think there's a lack of zeal for weather in young people these days. That's there, but having as you were all saying, having a sense that the federal government is a place you could contribute is really important too.
Yes.
There's one last thing we talked. You talked about the degradation of systems and stuff, and you bring to mind a conversation I had with Will Happer, who's a physicist. He's part of Jasons. The Jasons are those those guys and women who advise the Pentagon on big questions. He's at Princeton, and he's a total. He believes CO2 is the best thing that ever happened. He's a complete climate. I don't like the word denier, but he denies that there's any seriousness to the climate problem. Trump recruited him, and he ended up in Trump's National Security Council. But listen to what he said about maintenance here. This is a conversation I had with him when he was being vetted possibly to be the science advisor for Trump. He didn't get that position, but he ended up in. So I'm going to skip over the part about CO2 being great, but this is what he says about maintenance. So there's that. But then listen to this.
I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear it? Oh, let me make sure the sound is working. Can you not hear it either, anyone? Oh, maybe I screwed up the settings. Rather than try to replay it, he says basically Congress is very bad at sustaining budgets for systems that give us the data that underlies our sense of what's normal, what's abnormal, and what do you do about it. And he says so Congress, and the way we kind of discount the need for sustained observations and data is a part of the crisis too. And that relates to what you were saying about modernization, but it's also just the boring stuff, like those technicians you say are not running around.
The whole budgeting process is like that, Andy. When you build a building, you need to allocate money to continue to maintain it. Right. Try to get that through OMB. They don't do it. And then you have to fight year after year to get enough money to repair the plumbing or whatever. The same way with equipment, they'll let you buy the radar, they'll let you buy the spares, but they won't necessarily allow you the money to pay for the maintenance and get additional spares after those initial ones are gone.
That's so nuts.
It's a battle that you face all the time in an operational environment.
By the way, I do think I have this set up correctly now. So let's hear what he says. Whoops.
Say in climate is that ocean buoys, I think those are wonderful things. Maintain and improve if I could.
Let me get to the beginning. It's worth hearing. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I'm all for climate science. If I were king, I would maintain and improve if I could. Any measurement systems we have, satellites, ocean buoys. I think those are wonderful things. And one of our problems, say in climate, is that there you need long-term good science, for example, long-term temperature records, long-term records of CO2. And it's very hard, for the government to support that kind of stuff because, you go to Congress and they say, isn't that what you were doing 20 years ago or 50 years? Right. Yeah, measuring temperature, aren't you finished yet?
I love that last line.
Right.
Measuring temperature, aren't you finished yet? Oh boy, we have work to do in terms of congressional I don't know if there's a solution for that. As Joe was saying, it's kind of built into the budget, the way budgets work in this country.
I was told when I spent a lot of time, and this was when Joe was director of the NWS in Washington, D.C., that in the Washington and congressional environment, nothing succeeds like failure.
Oh, yeah.
That when you have a September 11th, the money just pours out to the same people who messed up the intelligence analysis prior to September 11th. But when someone like the Weather Service is actually driving tornado deaths down and is improving tornado warnings and improving tornado watches, which was the case, as Joe pointed out, when he was director, try to get money then, and it's nearly impossible.
Wow. Well, more to do. Thank you all for being here today. And to Andrew Freedman from CNN for popping in briefly. He said he got a lot of it, but he has to actually do the next story he's doing. And let's just do this again. Joe Friday, Mike Smith, Alan Gerard, thanks for your time. And this is Sustain What? Andy Revkin from rural coastal Maine. where the weather is beautiful right now. Stay safe. Stay informed.
Right.
Okay.
Share
Same.
what you
Thank you all.
take care.
Okay.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was really great.